So in today's video, we're going to be working with breaking down our problematic attachments to things in the world. Coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to live a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So one thing we may ask is, how does our sense of difficulty with the world, our sense that the world is not quite right, or is in some sense unsatisfactory? This is one of the things that brings us, I think, to a practice like this, a philosophical practice of trying to put things into place. Where does that sense of unrightness come from? And one of the ways that it comes, one of the key ways that it comes, at least in early Buddhist understanding, is through the senses, through our sense interaction with the world. That is to say, our senses interact with the world in many ways that bind us in ways that are not healthy for us to external objects, to external things that we want or that we react against. And it's understanding that and sort of breaking that down, analyzing that into its parts, that we can take some of the power out of that attachment. And to do this, the Buddha analyzes our life, our world, in what we might call sort of empiricist terms. Now, empiricism is a term of Western philosophy, but it's basically the idea that how we know about the world comes through our senses. So we have information about the world from our eyes, from our ears, from our nose, we smell things, from our taste, from our skin, from how we touch. And for the Buddhist understanding, it's also the mind. The mind is considered sort of we might call the sixth sense. It's a sense that senses ideas. And we can take that literally or figuratively, but that is the kind of envelope in which our world persists. And the Buddha talks about each of these six senses, that's the five traditional senses plus the mind. He talks about them as what are called sense spheres. The sense sphere is each sense and its object, which interrelate in a kind of a causal dance. So, for example, we have the eye, which would include, let's say, the visual cortex, so it's the capacity to see, plus we have visual forms in front of us that we can see. We have the ear and the auditory cortex, but we also have sounds that propagate to the ear that we can hear. And so the eye and forms is that sense sphere, is the visual sense sphere. The ear and sounds is that sense sphere. And it's understanding these sense spheres that is one of the keys to traditional Buddhist practice. It's one of the things that we see, for example, in the fourth foundation of mindfulness, where the Buddha asks us to be mindful of each of these sense spheres. And they're important because each of them involves its own kind of attachment. That is, the eye will attach to forms, certain forms, the ear will attach to sounds, and here by attachment we both mean a positive attachment to pleasant things, and we also mean aversion, that is to say negative attachment to unpleasant things. And the word is usually translated or often translated as fetter, a fetter meaning an attachment, the kind of thing that chains you to something else. So one question that we find in an early text is between Sariputta, who was the Buddha's main disciple, his sort of first disciple, and Mahakotita, who was another monk, another monastic. And Mahakotita wanted to know, how do these fetters work? In particular, what he asks is the eye the fetter of forms? That is to say, is the eye, the part of our body that sees things, is that the fetter of visual forms on the outside, or is it the other way around? Are the forms the fetter of the eye? This is a kind of an odd question, and to my understanding, the question here revolves around what is the problem? Okay, so where do we locate the real location of difficulty here? Where do we work? What do we work with? Because let's say, if the eye is the fetter of forms, then something's wrong with our visual cortex, as it were, with our seeing, with our hearing. And if we could only sort of get a better sight, if we could only get a better eye, we would be able to relax that fetter. We would be able to unbind ourselves. So is the eye the problem? Or is visual form the problem? Are sounds the problem? And here we might say, well, if sounds are the problem, then really the issue is, how do we change sounds? Okay, so if sounds are the real fetter, if they're the thing that are the binding force, then we might want to say, okay, so clearly we want to get, one option would be to get to a place that's much quieter. One option would be to get to a place maybe where forms aren't as pleasant or aren't as unpleasant, if they're the fetter, if they're the problem. And we can see this, we can consider this with all of the six senses, right? So all of the five senses plus the mental sense, which involves ideas. So, if ideas are the fetter, then maybe we have to get away from ideas or get the right kinds of ideas. Sariputta says that's not the case. He says that neither is it the case that eyes are the fetter of the form, nor is it the case that forms are the fetter of the eye. So then what is the fetter? What is the attachment? And Sariputta gives what I think is an extremely wise response. He says that the fetter, the attachment, is that desire and passion that arises between the eye and forms, between these two things. So he gives a simile. He says that it's like you have a black ox and a white ox. Now, if they are yoked together, we don't say that the black ox is the fetter of the white ox, or that the white ox is the fetter of the black ox. What we say is they're both fettered by the yoke that attaches the two of them. And in the case of each of these six sense spheres, the fetter is then that kind of desire and passion that arises in dependence upon let's say the eye and visual forms. So, for example, what he says, and what we might say, is that in the case that you are pleased by something you see, and something you see is beautiful, the fetter, the attachment, is the delight that arises in dependence upon the eye and the form. So, for example, we see something beautiful. We witness a beautiful sunset at night. There comes a delight in us, and that delight is a kind of a passion that doesn't want this thing to end, that clings to it, that identifies with it. That is the fetter. And similarly, in the case where we see something that we don't like, or we hear a sound that we find very annoying, let's say we're doing practice, or we're in a crowded space and somebody's making loud noise. The fetter then, in that circumstance, is the aversion that arises in dependence upon the ear and that noise. And that aversion becomes the fetter. It becomes that passion, that negative that desire to get rid of a certain kind of experience is the fetter. Similarly, he also says, and this is, I think, somewhat harder to see, but nevertheless, that in the case of neutral sensations, of course, remember there's positive sensations or pleasant and there's unpleasant, but there's also the neutral part in the middle. And he says, in dependence upon neutral sensations, there arises ignorance. And I think the idea here is that we are lulled into a kind of ignorance by sensations that don't sort of make us pleased or displeased. And so the fetter that keeps us attached to the world is this sort of unwillingness to investigate further in that case, in the case of neutral experiences. So we see that what Sariputta has sketched out for us here is that there are 6 different kinds of attachments. There's an attachment through each of the 6 sense bases, or 6 sense spheres. Attachment, obviously, to all of the physical senses. There's also attachment through the mind to ideas. We get attached to pleasant ideas. We get aversive to unpleasant ideas. Now, so what is the response? How do we detach ourselves from these fetters? How do we release ourselves from these fetters, from these bonds? The practice that's recommended is a practice of insight, which is, of course, a long and deep practice. That's not the kind of thing you can probably expect to happen overnight. Basically, it's a long practice of understanding that these sensations, that both the sensation itself as well as the sense base, that is to say the eyes and ears and nose and so on, all of these are impermanent. They're always coming and going. They're all non-self. They're not who you are. They're nothing to identify with. And they're all pretty clearly not satisfactory. They don't persist. Insofar as there's anything satisfactory there, it's something that goes away in time because it's impermanent. So, for example, there was a friend of mine who talked about, being in a subway and somebody pressing up against him and feeling annoyed by that. Or, in my own experience, of course, many times in the subway in New York, if I'm in the subway, there are loud noises, people, let's say, playing music. You can sit there and be annoyed about it, but if the wiser approach is to think about it with these kinds of characteristics, that it's not something that's going to persist, that it's not something that's you or not you, it's not something to be reacted against because it's not the way you like things, but also it really does help simply to see it as it is. It's simply an unpleasant, let's say, feeling at the base of your skin or the side of your arm. It's really only an unpleasant kind of experience at your ear. And it's the sort of thing that's going to go away in time if you just give it a few seconds. The very famous Thai forest teacher, Ajahn Chah, used to talk about noise this way, about sounds. There was a famous incident where people in a neighboring village were playing loud music at night because they had some sort of festival that was going over several nights. And the monks who were trying to meditate at night were annoyed by this noise that kept going on and on. And so eventually, after a couple of days, they went to talk to Ajahn Chah. And they told him, why don't you go and talk to these villagers and tell them to turn the music down at night? Because Ajahn Chah was a very well-respected elder in the area, and certainly would have had the clout to have made a difference. And Ajahn Chah, instead of saying that he would do that, he basically smiled at the monks and said, don't disturb the noise. The basic idea being, noise is its own thing. It should be just thought of as part of the sense spheres. It's part of the world. It's part of the objective feature of reality. Just let it be. Don't disturb it by getting angry. It's the anger that's really the problem rather than the noise itself, at least in this instance. Also, once we've understood some of the roots of our own difficulties this way with these six sense spheres, we can also see one route towards understanding something of a progress along the path, what that entails. And the way that it entails something that's not simply a cognitive kind of understanding of the world. So, for example, one way to know about how we're doing along the path is to pay attention, to be mindful of each of these six sense spheres, and to ask ourselves, to what extent are these kinds of desires and passions arising with our sense contact with things in the world? To what extent, when we see something, is a passion arising or a desire for it arising? To what extent, when we hear something, hear something unpleasant, is there an aversion arising? And to the extent that there is, then we know we have more work to do. And to the extent that there isn't, or at least that there, let's say, is less than there was a year ago, which is a big thing. I mean, if we can notice that we're still beset by certain kinds of desires and aversions, nevertheless, we can see that we're somewhat less desirous of things, or somewhat less aversive. We know that we're making a certain kind of progress. And note that while talking of this thing in terms of progress or not is a kind of inference, and we can leave that aside, we know directly, without inference, that we're happy. We know that we're happy, or we know that we're less attached. Not because of our acceptance of certain kinds of sentences or propositions, or because we can check some box in some book, as if this were a test of some kind. It's not. It's rather that we know these things simply because we find that emotionally we are in a more stable and wiser place. And that is one of, I think, the secrets to living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, is because when we see the world in this way, we see it with more wisdom. We see it with a greater depth, with greater accuracy, at least in regards to the most important parts of a lived life. We see it, I think, with more kindness, because we're less aversive towards the actions of other people. We're more accepting of the fact that people do things certain ways that may not be our way. And also that we're less stressed, because we're less fettered or attached to things in the world and being pulled this way and that by them. So I'd be interested to hear how these kinds of sense attachments impact your life. How have you worked with this before? If you haven't, does it interest you to do this? Have you thought about it? Or let's say after you watch the video, try to do a meditation session and come back and let us know what's happened. And if you want a deeper discussion, check out my Patreon page. That's something new and it might be of interest to you. And anyway, thanks so much for your comments and questions in the past. Wonderful things to read and contemplate on. And we will catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks so much for being here, and be well.